This conference aims to tackle the difficult and controversial relationship between an artistic subject and its formal treatment. In the present case, between the modern subject and the modern form, we are going to tackle the relationship between the harshness and roughness of Edward Manet's brushwork and the mechanical, almost scientific dots of Georges Seurat and the subject of his painting. In other words, I would like to ask, does this new manner of painting serve to distance art from the painting's duty of representation and narration? After all, these are duties that had been assigned to it for centuries, since figurative painting. Reformulated, we could ask, does this new way of painting serve to emancipate brushstrokes, pigments and surfaces from their narrative duty? This is a story you know well. It is the official story of modern art, or at least an unchallenged version, spanning 75 years. Over and over again, it tells us that the Impressionists paved the way for the Post-Impressionists, with Paul Gauguin, Vincent van Gogh and Paul Cézanne, who in turn paved the way for the Cubists and Fauvists as precursors of Surrealists. All of this resulted in modernist, abstract art. But this is a formalist version of art history that I will not adhere to today. It is a version that still holds some weight in France. However, in the English-speaking world, some historians have favoured a social reading of these stylistic changes for quite a while. My story today is based on what is known as social art history. Instead of presenting art history as a progressive process of the desocialization of art, an art that gradually breaks away from its duty to depict our society, I'm going to show you that this art is, conversely, more realistic than ever before. This is because it achieved harmony between, on the one hand, modern life with its colours, pace, smells and moral values, and on the other hand, an artistic form whose pace, colours and maybe even smells were adapted to this modern life. We will test this methodology on three major modern works: Manet's The Old Musician, his Argenteuil, and third, Seurat's A Sunday Afternoon at the Grand Jet. So let's begin with The Old Musician and ask how it might meet academic criteria. This is The Old Musician, painted in 1862. Had it been presented at the Salon, it would not have been accepted by the jury for one simple reason: it did not follow the rules of academic art. Instead, the Louis Martinet Gallery exhibited it alongside other works by Manet. To judge the merits of the painting, let's put ourselves in the shoes of a traditional art critic, as a follower of the academic norms. We would therefore ask ourselves a few simple questions. Is the composition harmonious? Has the artist used perspective? Where is the vanishing point? What is the narrative structure? What is the painting about? Answering these questions may be challenging, but let's try. Let's talk scale. The painting is 3 by 2 meters, which is not an insignificant detail. In fact, it is crucial, for 3 by 2 meters is getting close to the scale of a history painting. Let's look back at history paintings for a moment. In the mid-19th century, there was a hierarchy of genres, with a corresponding hierarchy of formats. The hierarchy of genres, established in the 17th century, placed history, religious or mythological paintings at the top of the pyramid. After all, significant subjects such as these deserved a significant size. Remember Louis XIV's portrait on the walls of the Palace of Versailles? Then came the other genres that included portraits, then genre paintings, scenes depicting everyday life, which was soon followed by landscapes and still life paintings. There was a corresponding hierarchy of formats, which is quite logical, because imagine if it was not the case. In a previous conference, we saw Manet's still life with salmon, and you can see that it wouldn't make sense to paint a 10 by 5 salmon to put it in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. So it's agreed. Where there's a hierarchy of genres, there needs to be a hierarchy of formats. 2 by 3 meters is already matching the size of a history painting. It's no longer the size of the small genre paintings of gypsies that you might put in your reception room. To explain what is, quite frankly, troublesome for the academic eye observing this painting, I propose we make a theoretical detour and revisit academic painting itself. The Royal Academy of Painting, the sanctuary of academic art in France, was established in 1648 under Louis XIV, with Charles Lebrun in charge. Lebrun was very young at the time, only 29 years old. In his first speech, he spoke about painting in terms of simplicity, harmony, clarity, and balance. The aim of these rules was to guarantee painting the status of a liberal art, because, yes, up until this point, painting had been considered manual labour or craft. This explains why Pierre-Paul Rubens' greatest challenge was to obtain the status of a liberal artist, that is, of an intellectual and a humanist who was capable of producing art that was the work of intelligence. To achieve this, a strict criteria had to be adhered to. The first of these elements was the importance of disegno over colorito. This makes sense. A drawing is done in pencil. You sketch an outline and simulate modelling, which is not given by nature. Therefore, you have to demonstrate reason, intelligence and skill to draw and transfer a retinal image onto paper, whilst colour is simply provided by nature. We end up associating drawing with reason and colour with emotion. On this subject, let me read you a sentence written by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, the great academic master of the first half of the 19th century. Drawing makes up 3/4 and a half of what constitutes painting, he wrote, in the authoritative publication Grammaire des Arts du Dessin, which became a sort of Bible for artists since it was published in 1867 and was reprinted a number of times. Charles Blanc added that the union of drawing and colour is necessary to engender painting, just as the union of man and woman to engender humanity. But drawing must conserve its preponderance over colour. If it is otherwise, painting will run to ruin. It will be lost through colour, as humanity was lost through Eve. They associated drawing with masculinity, with intelligence and reason, whilst colour was relegated to emotion and femininity. The second of these elements was about the finish in painting. We said before that the Academy's principles aimed to raise this manual labour, this handicraft, to the status of a liberal art. In order to do this, they needed to make people forget about its manual and material origins, which meant making sure that no traces were left by concealing any evidence of brushwork. To create a perfect illusion, the beholder was to be placed before a window opening onto a tri-dimensional space, rather than being placed in front of a cloth covered with layers of paint. Indeed, Ingres stated that the brushstroke, as accomplished as it may be, should not be visible. Otherwise it prevents the illusion and immobilizes everything. Instead of the object represented, it calls attention to the process. Instead of the thought, it betrays the hand. A painting is never a sketch. The traces of the paintbrush are to disappear so that a painting can be acknowledged as such. Now, when we are confronted with the Academy's criteria, what can be said about Manet's new style of painting? Well, alas, it does not meet the criteria, and he knew it. That is why Manet didn't even submit the painting to the Salon. We've understood that basic academic criteria was definitely not met. Let's turn to a study of the old musician on the basis of its perspective, landscape, composition and subject. Let's begin by studying its perspective and composition. I cannot see any evident lines of perspective, and if there is a vanishing point, it should be stuck in the forefront. Thus, it is missing its function of perforating the pictorial space. Then, the landscape. How is it constructed? Where are we? What do these hazy pigments stand for? Nothing about it is very clear. On the left is a cut-off tree, and on the right is a cut-off figure. If Manet had intended to create what we call repoussoir, to introduce the gaze into the picture, he has fragmented them. Two elements are also often featured in landscape painting, for example, tree trunks that frame the spectator's gaze. This gaze is then guided by the perspective lines towards the vanishing point for the painting to perform its illusionistic task and ensure the oblivion of the spectator's space. Generally, the gaze is already isolated from the museum walls by a frame, but if there are also 2 points that frame the gaze on the left and on the right is the image itself, repoussoirs, the illusion of entering a tri-dimensional space is better secured. Here, as repoussoirs, if we can call them that, we have half a branch and half a man, but it does not work. It is not very academic. Now I'm going to focus on the composition of the painting's main body. We've said that academic painting aspired to be recognised as a liberal art, as it wanted to be compared to geometry, to poetry, and above all, to rhetoric. Rhetoric was the art of speaking, where every word fits another to create a speech, a discursive framework. Painting aspired to follow a similar procedure. It was intended that each fragment, each figure, should fit all together to achieve a pictorial coherence. Yet here we have elements that seem to be set against one another, which abruptly fit to the landscape, thereby portraying a collection of fragments. Let's look closer. First, the girl on this shadow. Her arm or skirt seemed to be touching the arm of the young boy behind. But is he really next to her? Yes, he is behind her, as his feet are painted further back. But why do their bodies appear to touch one another? A similar inconsistency takes place here on the right. The cape of one and the cape of the other seem to make contact. But if we look closely, the distance of their feet indicates that they are actually situated one behind the other. So the characters don't fit together somehow. Are they aware of each other? Not really. If I ask the question, what's going on? Or what are they doing together? I would answer that we have sketches, preliminary drawings and outlines that have been produced one after another on this canvas. Look at their expressions. This one is looking blankly towards the left, while the other one is squinting. Either there was an object here that he was looking at, which has since disappeared, or his expression is uncomfortably vague, void of an expression that is conscious of the space around him. This one on the right with a top hat has an indistinct look that seems to skim over the children's heads. Only this man in the centre is looking straight at us. The painting is infused with anonymization. They are not aware of the presence of the others and don't even have any apparent reason for being together. Monsieur Josephin Péladan, Tsar Péladan, was a sort of guru for the symbolist movement. In 1884, more than 20 years after this painting, he wrote, "Manet is merely a painter and a painter of fragments. This is important. Without ideal, without conception, without emotion, without poetry, without design, incapable of a composed picture." Drawing, I repeat, was the ultimate academic criteria to judge the quality of a work. So, 20 years after its completion, Manet was still under attack for failing to compose a painting, thanks to his disjointed composition. In theory, our painting depicts gypsies, but there is no recognizable group. Such a subject was not banned. Look at The Stolen Child by Henri-Guillaume Schlesinger, presented here as an engraving. This bohemian scene was accepted at the Salon in 1861 and reproduced in the Magasin Picturesque, a periodical that Manet certainly skimmed through. We have a group of gypsies, and with them we are thrust into the lives of a nomadic community. They have a reason for being together and are not simply thrown together on a canvas. It's the same with Alfred Dedodenk's Gypsies Returning from a Fiesta in Andalusia. Dedodenk was an academic painter. He studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and a little after the Orientalist movement travelled to Spain and to Morocco, both of which he fell in love with. Although he didn't just fall in love with the countries, he also fell in love with a Spanish woman, who he later married. So here we have a group of gypsies going home after an Andalusian party. They have a reason for being together. They are a moving mass. Each character's position fits together, and they have a shared activity. I chose this other painting by Dedodenk because again it is a scene depicting gypsies walking, but this time with a limited number of figures. There is something reminiscent of the old musician, except that they have a shared activity and a reason for being together. They are going down a road together, aware of each other's presence. Here is the father, mother, daughter, and perhaps even the grandmother on a donkey. Here is another gypsy scene by Achille Zo, who was also an academic painter. Zo painted in Bayonne and was awarded a medal for this very painting. The work is still in Bayonne Museum. So the old musician is part of a tradition of depictions of gypsies. but it's badly composed and poorly finished. Worse still, look at these faces. They are merely sketched, then covered with layers of oil with visible brushstrokes. Again, painters aspired to the status of a liberal artist, meaning that painting's manual origins must be concealed. What you have here is a perfect example of a sketch, and next to it is the corresponding finished painting with detailed faces. The sketch, on the other hand, is just a preliminary work. The faces haven't yet been completed. When I zoom in, blobs of paint appear. The faces are still splashes of paint. Preliminary sketches are not to be exhibited because they are unfinished. This is why, by showing a painting that looked like a sketch, Manet was accused of laziness. Let us continue with our analysis of the implications of the old musician's size, which fits into the logic and tradition of history painting. Comparing it to two models, Raphael's School of Athens and Couture's Romans in their decadence. Let us continue with our analysis of the implications of the old musician's size, which fits into the logic and tradition of history painting. Look at this exceptional painting, Raphael's School of Athens. We have the perfect example of a work that would become a model for academic painting. We can see perspectival lines thanks to the architectural edges that lead us to a vanishing point. The vanishing point, as its name suggests, allows the gaze to penetrate deep into the painting until the lines converge in a fictional three-dimensional space. It enables painters to create a space in which a painted figure can move, live, speak, and argue. All figures are alive. All are fully aware of belonging to a group. They are chatting and there is interaction. We have a foreground, a near middle ground, a middle ground, a far middle ground, and a background. It brilliantly embodies the lofty criteria of an academic painting. And yet, Manet doesn't adhere to these rules. Manet chose to study under a certain Thomas Couture. He joined Couture's workshop in 1849, 2 years after Couture made a name for himself with this painting, Romans of Decadence. This means that when Manet chose his workshop, he was well aware that he was selecting a tutor who was a bit of an outsider in the machine of the academy. You may think that these Romans still seem to be very much working in the academic style. Indeed, they almost are, but if we look a little closer, then there are some problematic details. Couture was known to have high expectations of his students, demanding swift, almost instantaneous completion of works. He made them successively outline, sketch and draw from paintings and sculptures in the Louvre to achieve a spontaneity in all stages of their works, which was not expected at the École des Beaux-Arts. He had a particular appreciation for ébauche, which is the underpainted basis of a finished painting. Couture generously practiced and taught sketching. He would mark areas of shadow and light, tracing the outlines of faces by rubbing a piece of cloth. However, we are going to see how this academic painting kept aspects of the aesthetic of Couture's ébauche without being an ébauche itself. The details of the faces and the bodies are clear, but Couture kept some features of the preliminary work, violating several of the rules of the Academy in terms of tridimensionality, perspective, vanishing points, and colouring. First and foremost is the perspective. When you compare this painting to this one here, you can see that in each case, the lines of perspective are made visible by the outlines of the architecture. We have the same architectural elements here, but given that the architecture is less present, we only see the tip. As a result, the lines of perspective indirectly appear again through the architecture, but this time more discreetly. However, the perspective is also revealed by the 4 columns on either side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's easy to imagine the perspective grid and frame our gaze, a little like repoussoirs. However, bear in mind that lines of perspective are intended to simulate distance on a canvas. Yet in this case, the perspective is limited and its attempts are thwarted over and over again. Firstly, notice the two columns in the centre. They are certainly smaller than the ones there, but the difference is so slight that they resist fitting the grid of perspective. The consequence of this insufficiently decreased size is that the middle ground remains quite near to us, shrinking the space of this orgiastic crowd. Secondly, the vanishing point. We said that this is the point towards which the gaze is drawn, taking it far into fictive tridimensionality. So we have a middle ground which is shortened by columns, and is therefore only slightly receding, and a vanishing point that's between the statue's legs that hardly fades away. We could refer to a lack of depth and to shallowness. This painting is closed off, flattened. Thirdly, placed either side in front of the fourth columns, at the same distance from the viewer, are two statues. The fact that they are equidistant from the viewer means that the figure sitting on the left is the same distance from us as the one standing up, who looks a little like Titian's Bacchus. It is therefore difficult to situate this figure. Judging by the columns, he is level with the figure on the left, but judging by his size, he is behind. His feet seem to be resting on the heads of these figures at the front, who have their backs against the same pedestal. In this way, we have a triangle of figures piled up, rather than figures placed one behind the other. Speaking of piled up figures, remember that when they depicted crowds in Roman times, in the 3rd and 4th century AD, they would draw piles of little heads. This was before the invention of perspective. Here, however, we have a master of the academy, Couture, who taught the art of painting and drawing but manipulated perspective. He flattened volumes and fitted them together to the extent that we are given the impression of a pile-up, rather than figures placed one behind the other. Another aspect is tonality. We said previously that there are different tools enabling artists to dig into a canvas and create three-dimensional fictions. Perspective is one of these tools. But it is not the only one. The juxtaposition of warm and cold colours is another. In general, warm colours tend to project. It's an optical illusion, whilst cold colours tend to recede. Yet here, if we consider that reds are warm colours and blues are cold colours, we see that Couture composed his painting in a way that flattens it. He uses blue to create an optical recession for the figures in front of the red ones. Here, the red veil is in front of a blue one. But here on the right, the figure in blue is in front of the figure in red. In other words, Couture alternates cold and warm colours, using a receding blue tone for a character in the foreground. It is as if he were weaving with threads to create a flat tapestry that alternates reds and blues, preventing their optical spatiality. Couture uses perspective, certainly, but limits its effects. With his oversized columns and rather obstructed vanishing point, he shrinks the pictorial space. His use of a restricted palette and the alternation of red and blue hues counterbalance the colour's ability to create an optical illusion of a recessive space. He tends to put blues at the front of this work, whilst traditionally they were used at the back. He thus flattens his painting. This restricted palette leaves a lingering impression of an ébauche. Yes, the painting is an academic painting. Nevertheless, the restricted colour palette in the ébauche's lack of perspective remain. If we look at Leonardo da Vinci's unfinished work, Adoration of the Magi, we have bluish masses that are alternated with reddish masses. It reflects the spirit of an ébauche. Only areas of light and shade are marked by zones of colour, and this spirited surface is the work of Couture. Okay, Manet took this logic a little further. What he exhibited was considered unfinished, horrifying his peers and certainly not pleasing Couture. Legend has it that they argued, which is both true and false. It was true because when he presented the absinthe drinker to the Salon in 1859, the painting was rejected. We will turn to this in a minute. When he found out that it had been rejected, he is claimed to have said, "It's Couture's fault. He spoke badly of my painting to his peers." Maybe so. It is also reported that Couture exclaimed in front of Manet's absinthe drinker, "An absinthe drinker? And they paint abominations like that? My poor friend, you are the absinthe drinker. It is you who have lost your moral sense." So yes, Couture disapproved of his pupil because Manet's way of painting was not at all in line with his expectations. Nevertheless, the logic of the ébauche that we see in this painting came from him.